Prepare to unearth the true saga of a cartel that didn't just move cocaine, but fundamentally reshaped the landscape of organized crime, forging a multi-billion-dollar empire whose profound legacy continues to resonate even today. Forget everything you thought you knew about Pablo Escobar. In this deep dive, we'll immerse ourselves in the lives of other architects, equally potent yet far less recognized, of this shadowy dominion, individuals who ascended to become the wealthiest criminals of their era. Brace yourself to discover precisely how the Medellín Cartel was built and who its genuine leaders truly were. The Medellín Cartel was far more than a mere criminal organization. It was a colossal criminal empire that, for an extended period, stood as a synonym for cocaine trafficking, forever altering the dynamics of illicit enterprises. Its foundation was laid by Pablo Escobar, Carlos Lehder, José Rodríguez Gacha, and the Ochoa brothers. While much has already been recounted about Pablo Escobar, this narrative will shine a spotlight on the other masterminds of Medellín's smuggling operations who managed to amass staggering fortunes. Carlos Lehder, uniquely among all the pivotal figures of Medellín, left behind written memoirs detailing that period of his life, distinguishing himself by having his activities more comprehensively documented. A great deal about him was also disclosed by George Jung, famous from the film Blow, starring Johnny Depp, from his book to numerous interviews. The press, too, extensively covered Lehder. Carlos Enrique Lehder Rivas was born on September 7, 1949, in Armenia, the capital of Colombia's Quindío department. His father, a German engineer, had arrived in Colombia in 1927 to work on the railway construction between Pereira and Manizales. His mother, Helena Rivas, a former beauty queen and daughter of a jeweler, met him in the same city. Following their marriage, they had 4 children. Lehder Sr., who went by Guillermo, permanently resided in Colombia, only occasionally visiting relatives in his homeland. Due to his father's German heritage, Carlos was nicknamed El Alemán, the German, from childhood. The family enjoyed a comfortable life, owning a small business that manufactured and imported precious oils and premium wines, in addition to a modest hotel named Pensión Alemana, German Inn. This establishment was consistently monitored by authorities due to a large influx of German citizens, though observations never escalated beyond that, despite the hotel's popularity among local officials. Rumors circulated that Carlos's father was a staunch Hitler loyalist, with a shrine to the Führer supposedly located beneath the staircase in their home. Carlos himself recalled being the black sheep of the family from an early age. His parents strived to provide their children with the finest education, but their youngest son stubbornly rebelled, effectively ending his schooling after the 6th grade. In 1959, Helena Rivas filed for divorce, accusing her husband of abuse. He responded with a similar lawsuit, citing his wife's infidelity. By 1961, the Supreme Court granted both petitions, dividing their assets and children. The older children remained with their father in Colombia, while Carlos and his younger brother moved with their mother to the United States. There, as he grew older, Carlos frequented the Jackson Heights neighborhood in Queens, a hub for many Colombians. Several years later, while working as a dishwasher, he encountered drivers from Cali who worked at a car rental agency. They always arrived in sleek new cars, and one day, Lehder overheard them selling a brand new vehicle for just $300. When he inquired about the low price, they explained he could use it for a month or 2, then sell it. Lehder immediately understood the car had been stolen from the agency where the drivers worked. As he himself put it, "The moment I decided to accept this tempting offer marked a turning point in my life. Ultimately, this decision determined my destiny in this world. This was my debut in crime." He was then 18 years old. He eventually sold that first car for parts, making slightly more than he had paid for it. Lehder soon became captivated by the prospect of stealing and reselling cars on his own. He devised a method. In the state of Vermont, bordering Canada, one only needed a dealer invoice and proof of state residency to obtain license plates and register a vehicle. Lehder traveled to Vermont, where he stayed at a Christian charity hostel, securing a residency certificate. Then, in the Bronx, he obtained copies of an original dealer invoice and successfully registered his first stolen car, selling it for $1,800 in a Mexican neighborhood. The buyer expressed interest in acquiring more good cars, and the business took off. His connections with Colombians working in parking garages, whom he recruited as accomplices, greatly aided him. While affluent Americans left their new luxury cars in the parking lot, the attendants would make duplicate keys, and at night, the cars would be stolen. Carlos himself dubbed this his full course on car theft. The parking attendant services cost $300 per car. Soon, he expanded the operation, transporting legalized cars from Vermont directly to Medellín. The historical moment when car thief Carlos Lehder intersected with drug trafficking occurred in his native Armenia, where a local dealer, Don Arturo, proposed he drive his truck to Bolivia to purchase a load of cocaine paste known as bazooka. The journey was long and arduous. Moreover, he and his friends lingered in Bolivia for 1.5 months because the supplier opted to send not paste, but ready-made cocaine hydrochloride. This marked their largest shipment to date, a substantial 42 kilograms. For his involvement in the deal, Lehder was promised 1 kilogram of cocaine, which was unceremoniously stolen from him in the port of Galveston, Texas. He recalled thinking at the time, "Better to steal cars than to transport coke. At least there, you have someone to hold accountable for the theft." Nevertheless, he made another trip for a load in Bolivia, after which he was offered, as a U.S. resident, to participate in a marijuana deal. This arrangement entailed Carlos renting a truck in the United States and, upon reaching a designated location, loading an airplane engine packed with 3 tons of pressed marijuana, which was to be transported across the border. However, DEA agents were already waiting for him. Carlos thus found himself in Dade County Jail, charged with conspiracy to import marijuana before being transferred to the federal maximum security prison in Danbury, Connecticut. In that state, he also faced federal charges of conspiracy and participation in car thefts. Due to his youth, he was 19 at the time, he could only receive a 2-year sentence upon conviction. Carlos pleaded guilty and served 18 months before being deported to his ancestral homeland. In prison, Lehder made productive use of his time. He began exercising, read extensively, finally completed high school, and enrolled in intensive English courses, where his boss was his cellmate, George Young. As Carlos himself recalled, Young was convinced his profession was selling weed and suggested Lehder pursue it, but Carlos refused, declaring that after that damned engine story, he would never get involved with weed again. Lehder discussed cocaine with Young a bit later, when the puzzle clicked in his mind. The loads he had transported from Bolivia were novelties in the early 1970s, an unpopular product. However, Young recounted how difficult it was to procure cocaine in the United States. People seemed eager to try it, but cocaine was scarce and of very low quality. After some time, groups of Colombian mules caught at the border transporting small quantities of cocaine in any conceivable way, in suitcases with false bottoms, children's toys, shoe heels, and so forth, began arriving in Danbury. Among them were even disabled individuals attempting to pass customs with packages in prosthetics or blind canes. All the mules consistently reported that new drug trafficking gangs had emerged, exporting cocaine. They would send 1 kilogram, at most 2, with each person, but there was enough work for everyone. It was then that Carlos told Young, "George, in 7 months, I'll be back in Colombia, and we're going to get rich." In prison, Lehder devoured many books, but one, in particular, captured his imagination. An old account of the Opium Wars, which unfolded between 1839 and 1842 in Hong Kong. It narrated the adventures of British smugglers transporting opium from India, utilizing the pirate island of Hong Kong, from where Chinese captains, on dozens of swift junks, would then ferry the opium to the mainland. Carlos described this epiphany thus: "I extrapolated this story to my own plans. I wanted to deliver cocaine to the U.S. coast, and thanks to this book, the idea came to me to create a hidden operational base near American shores. I wanted to establish my own Hong Kong island, but not for opium. Instead, it would be for South American cocaine." Upon his release from prison, the 21-year-old Lehder, alongside Young, set about executing their predefined plans. More extensive details about their escapades and the genesis of their transport business can be found in the video about Jung. Incidentally, Lehder has his own perspective on what transpired between him and Jung. He asserts that George, through his irresponsible behavior, gradually alienated everyone and so severely hampered operations that his primary distributor, Richard Burrell, whose contacts Jung refused to share with Carlos, expressed a desire to directly engage with the Colombians. Soon, the first substantial sums of money began to pour in, and Lehder initiated money laundering operations, establishing a car dealership named Lehder Auto in Medellín, situated in the prestigious El Poblado neighborhood near the San Diego shopping center. It was in this office that he indirectly met Pablo Escobar. Escobar's cousin, Gustavo Gaviria, purchased a pair of luxurious Porsches through Lehder's showroom. Whispers about two rogues capable of moving goods into the United States began to circulate in Colombia, where many had grasped cocaine's burgeoning potential. Laboratories appeared, farmers started cultivating coca, and learned the basics of bazooka production. This is how Lehder came to know El Mexicano, José Rodríguez Gacha, an enterprising owner of several plantations and laboratories in Pueblo Viejo. Around the same time, in 1977, one of Lehder's pilots informed him about Norman's Cay in the Bahamas. Several houses were for sale there, and the island was ideally suited to serve as a pirate Hong Kong. It lay a mere 40 kilometers from Nassau and 140 kilometers from Miami. It boasted a wide paved airstrip and was devoid of authorities, as the island was registered as private property. Lehder acquired the local hotel, and the amiable elderly owners of the Norman's Cay Hotel remained oblivious to what would soon unfold. Carlos quickly established cordial relations with the local Minister of Agriculture during his visit to the island, presenting a substantial envelope for his election campaign, and began to assert control over the territory. Airplanes increasingly frequented the island, and more Colombians were engaged in construction and property maintenance. Within a year, Lehder occupied 70% of Norman's Cay's land and closed the hotel to halt the flow of tourists. The owners of the yacht club and dive center were, quite politely, asked not to return. However, as it later turned out, not only respectable citizens resided on the island, there was also Edward, who trafficked marijuana. Edward immediately recognized who had claimed the island and approached Lehder. Carlos was in dire need of experienced pilots, and Edward, after some slight resistance, began transporting cocaine with his crew. Shortly thereafter, the right-hand man of the Prime Minister of the Bahamas paid Lehder a visit. During the visit, he was convinced that Lehder was a serious businessman, as he immediately received a brand-new BMW as a gift. According to Carlos, they agreed upon $150,000 per month for island rent and a guarantee of security. Modern lighthouses and radar systems were installed on the island, the airstrip was renovated, state-of-the-art aircraft hangars were erected, and the perimeter was enclosed by an electrified fence with guard towers. There's even a legend that all local inhabitants were killed, but this is likely an exaggeration. Only one of the most stubborn individuals was found dead on a yacht, while the others were reportedly quite content with large sums of money for their forced relocation. And generally, as the dive center owner later recounted, upon arriving for the season's opening and spotting a tower equipped with a cannon, he had no desire whatsoever to dispute with the island's new proprietor. Later, Carlos imported ferocious Dobermans and German Shepherds from Germany, which became the hallmark of Norman's Cay. These dogs, along with heavily armed guards, patrolled the island's perimeter day and night. A close friend of Lehder named Yair Klein, a retired Israeli army officer, trained the security detail. Klein would, in the future, train the Medellín Cartel's militias to combat left-wing radicals and politicians. The island was not without a house for women, just as one would soon appear on Escobar's estate. The scale of the parties on the island was simply astonishing. All witnesses agree it was a veritable Sodom and Gomorrah on a Bahamian island, simultaneously home to a multitude of experienced, heavily armed smugglers and tons of pure cocaine. On Norman's Cay, Lehder established International Dutch Resource Limited, which served as a front for his genuine business, renting hangars and selling fuel to business partners who transported cocaine and marijuana to the United States. For $10,000, he leased small modern aircraft for drug transport and hired pilots. The island was managed by approximately 150 people, both Colombians and locals. This was 1977. In that year, Griselda Blanco, who had initially supported Pablo Escobar, began her war for leadership in the Miami cocaine market, while Pablo himself, Rodríguez Gacha, and the Ochoa clan had already forged the alliance that would later be known as the Medellín Cartel, and which Carlos Lehder would soon organically join as a transporter. None of Pablo's men, as they were then called in Medellín, spoke English, understood market conditions, or had particularly strong relationships with their northern neighbors. For instance, a brief visit by one of the Ochoas to Miami nearly ended in his arrest, but the volume of goods was already so immense that no army of mules could handle it, and it was then that Lehder and Young's transport company came to the rescue. At this juncture, we diverge from the story of Carlos Lehder to recount how Rodríguez Gacha and the Ochoa clan became full-fledged members of the Medellín Cartel. By 1976, the three largest traffickers had forged an amicable alliance in Medellín. At that time, their organization was not yet dubbed a cartel, but each of them had, in one way or another, attracted the attention of American authorities. A separate video covers Pablo Escobar. We will now focus on the others. Let us begin, perhaps, with the aforementioned Rodríguez Gacha, known as El Mexicano. Like Pablo Escobar, Gacha rose from humble beginnings. He was born into a poor peasant family in the village of Rogos, in the municipality of Pacho. Due to poverty, he was forced to leave school at the age of 12 and work clearing pastures. From childhood, he possessed an enterprising spirit, never allowing himself to be outdone, and also displayed numerous criminal talents. A curious fact: he never had official documents, neither a passport, military ID, nor driver's license. Formally, he did not exist. A little older, Gacha moved to Bogotá in search of a better life, where he met Gilberto Molina, an emerald magnate who, after eliminating all competitors in a decade-long struggle, became the undisputed master of the emerald mines. It was then that the young Gacha's talents proved useful. He first became an assassin for the Emerald King, and then led his own personal army. But El Mexicano had no desire to serve under anyone's command, and in the early 1970s, he turned his attention to the promising niche of marijuana trafficking. However, he quickly realized that weed was an exceedingly cumbersome commodity to transport, and did not yield the desired profits due to existing competition, unlike cocaine, which was rapidly gaining popularity. Gacha was also among the first to grasp a simple truth: acquiring cocaine paste in Peru and Bolivia was an unnecessary intermediate step. He consequently imported coca plants to his remote municipality of Pacho, forgotten by both God and the state. In the fertile climate, the plants yielded 3 to 4 harvests annually, and landless peasants from across the region began flocking to Pacho. Gacha first appeared on law enforcement radar in 1976. Around that time, he met Pablo Escobar, who was rapidly gaining momentum. A friendly relationship quickly formed between them, based on mutual respect for each other's authority. Furthermore, Gacha, unlike Pablo, never desired to become a politician. All he sought was to amass vast wealth. As DEA agent Baruch Vega put it, El Mexicano was always a more significant target than Pablo, as he controlled the majority of the plantations, in addition to the cartel's largest armed wing. By the late 1970s, approximately 4,000 hectares in the dense jungles were planted with coca bushes. By the late 1980s, this figure would exceed 150,000 hectares. His nickname, El Mexicano, was also bestowed upon him around this period. Among all members of the future Medellín Cartel, Gacha was the most affable towards Mexicans. He boasted an extensive collection of Mexican hats and named his properties in the spirit of his favorite country: the Chihuahua nightclub, the Meat Nampa bar, the Hermosillo ranch, and so forth. Like Escobar, Gacha actively engaged in philanthropy in his hometown. He built houses, provided financial assistance, and organized concerts. But above all, he adored soccer. Notably, he was a major shareholder in Bogotá's Millonarios Club, and many observed that his territory consistently boasted the most meticulously maintained and beautiful soccer fields. Indeed, Colombian soccer of that era was entirely sponsored by drug traffickers. This arrangement was advantageous for numerous reasons. First, they enjoyed it. Second, by investing money in the ballet for the poor, drug traffickers gained repute among ordinary people. And third, and most crucially, sports organizations provided a very convenient avenue for laundering money. Rodríguez Gacha's economic empire was controlled by the company Rodríguez G, whose board of directors included El Mexicano himself, his wife Gladys, and their children Douglas, Gonzalo, José Fabián, and Justa David. From this company, the drug trafficker managed his agribusiness Invigandes, through which he supplied livestock to his ranches in Cuernavaca, Mazatlan, Jalisco, Santa Rosa, Quinta La Chihuahua, and the Hermosillo Ranch. He also financed the Chihuahua horse breeding facility, where his opulent horses were kept, the crown jewel being Tupac Amaru, a stallion purchased for $1 million from Ochoa Sr. The company's recognizable logo, in the shape of a horse's head silhouette, adorned the entrance to his main residence in Pacho, known as Casa Gacha, famed for its extravagance. The house was designed by a Japanese architect to ensure it would not disturb neighbors. Gacha enjoyed live concerts but respected others, so the walls were soundproofed. The interior decor astonished with its luxury. Bearskins, antique European crockery, and gold, plenty of gold. According to legend, even the water faucets at Casa Gacha were pure gold, and beneath the building lay a system of hidden compartments for money and secret tunnels. In Bogotá, Gacha owned 8 fabulously expensive apartments and an entertainment complex near the Guaymaral airport, from which ready cocaine departed. Adjacent to the airport was his personal hangar with several aircraft, assigned to a private runway. Thus, by 1982, Rodríguez Gacha possessed the highest commercial potential within the cartel, yet he never aspired to overall power. He was content to be a leader in his remote locale, where he was effectively a governor. The situation was different for the third participants in the Medellín criminal group. Unlike Pablo Escobar and Rodríguez Gacha, the Ochoa brothers were born into a relatively respectable and esteemed cattle ranching family in Antioquia. Their great-grandparents received state recognition for establishing the region's first equestrian fair and veterinary academy. And generally, the Ochoa surname was synonymous with horse breeding. Griselda Blanco, for instance, harbored a well-founded resentment towards them. Raised on the outskirts of the city, she had enviously observed the Ochoa's beautiful home in the hills since childhood. Though it should be noted that their position and status in Medellín at that time did not signify excessive wealth, as it did for many other residents who constantly worried about finding their next meal. Jorge, the second of Fabio Ochoa Restrepo and Margarita Vásquez's 3 sons, was born 2 months before Escobar and knew him from childhood. Ochoa's father, a comically corpulent man, was renowned as the finest horse trainer in the province and had developed a new, refined breed. In the mid-1960s, Fabio opened the family restaurant, Margaritas, named after their family hacienda in Antioquia. To avoid failure, all adult children worked tirelessly. Jorge himself and his brothers, the middle brother Juan David and the youngest, Fabio, as well as their sisters, as soon as they returned from school, would either cook or wash dishes. Lawyers and journalists often referenced Jorge's supposedly difficult childhood, claiming he dragged the family into cocaine smuggling because he pitied his mother and sisters who toiled from morning till night. But precisely how this respectable and esteemed family became involved in cocaine trafficking remains unknown. At that time, Jorge was always prominently visible. He stood 6 feet tall and was prone to corpulence like his father. Fat Jorge, proportional to his income, rarely weighed less than 200 pounds. He did not resemble a criminal, much like everyone in his family. He was an exemplary family man, quiet and gentle-mannered, rarely indulging in a glass of dry white wine, never smoking tobacco, and certainly never touching drugs. Nevertheless, he possessed a keen business acumen. He viewed Americans' cocaine addiction as a vice, but a fairly harmless one. Let those who can afford it enjoy themselves, and he, Jorge Ochoa, would profit from human weaknesses. In the mid-1970s, he began visiting Texas for business and observing the market. Ochoa then traveled to Miami as an import-export specialist for horses. In reality, he was establishing contacts among local Colombians for selling cocaine on America's East Coast. Even today, the precise role of the family patriarch remains unclear. According to one version, he was the head not only of his clan but of the entire Medellín Cartel, which is why he lived a tranquil life, dedicated to horses and was never prosecuted, striving to distance himself from his sons who chose the path of vice. In 1977, in sunny Miami, Jorge Ochoa displayed genuine provincial recklessness. He boasted of having introduced a full 100 kilograms of cocaine into the United States. Most likely, this was an isolated operation, as a year prior, a relative of his had been arrested at the border with a minuscule shipment of 1.5 kilograms. This indicates that they, like everyone else at the time, employed mules. His interlocutor turned out to be a DEA informant, of whom there were many in Miami at that time. On October 12th of the same year, Jorge handed this man a suitcase containing 27 kilograms of cocaine and asked him to transport it to Miami. The DEA then arrested 9 Colombians, including Jorge Ochoa's sister and brother-in-law. Jorge himself was the sole escapee. Spotting the police, he jumped on a motorcycle and fled, narrowly evading arrest. Jorge immediately left Miami and never returned. In that year, Pablo Escobar, alongside his cousin Gustavo Gaviria, already controlled the collection of cocaine paste in Ecuador, sourced from Bolivia and Peru, and its processing in Colombia. Escobar and Ochoa, as the largest and most ambitious businessmen, joined forces to boost production capacity. Additionally, they managed laboratories and sold cocaine to distributors who controlled its marketing in the United States, where profits were 6 times higher than sales in Colombia. They soon monopolized the business in Florida, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Rodríguez Gacha then joined as a full member of the organization. When Carlos Lehder, who had acquired the Bahamian island of Norman's Cay, joined the company, supply volumes surged. By the early 1980s, Escobar established a kind of central office for the Medellín Cartel, where smaller Colombian drug traffickers were expected to deliver their merchandise. For other producers in the area, attempting to sell their goods independently simply became unprofitable. It's worth noting that with those who did not show off and accepted the Medellín's terms, business was conducted with extreme respect and peacefully, and there was always enough money for everyone. However, those who sought to resist the cartel's expansion lost, and often horrifically. A hallmark of the Medellín faction was, and remains, vindictiveness. Those who obstructed their path were exterminated to the last man, even if they couldn't be located immediately. Under the established office system, small vendors added their goods to large consignments, ensuring no one could bypass the cartel with their drugs. They ensured small loads and never dispatched a shipment unless an equivalent amount of cocaine was available in warehouses for replacement in case of seizure. DEA agents dubbed this insurance system Medellín's Lloyds in honor of a renowned banker of the era. Thus, by trading through the Medellín Cartel, small traffickers risked virtually nothing. Beyond this, the cartel also featured other individuals with diverse responsibilities. The cartel's financial and commercial links were managed by Gustavo Gaviria and Roberto Escobar, Pablo's older brother, who had worked in accounting for many years. Additionally, a military wing formed with figures such as Lucky, Papai, Papai, 2X, El Angelito, El Chapo, El Acido, El Tato, and numerous others. All of them constituted the cartel's security forces and army of hitmen, through whom the Medellín faction established a balance of power for control and dominance in drug trafficking. All were trained by the owner of the PMC Had Ahat, Yair Klein, a friend of Carlos Lehder, whom I mentioned earlier. It was rumored that by the late 1980s, the cartel commanded over 2,000 trained combatants. The most famous enforcer of the cartel in our modern era is perhaps Papai, who earned his nickname for his resemblance to the cartoon character. Like everyone else, he presented his version of who led the Medellín Cartel. According to him, it was Jorge Ochoa, and Pablo Escobar followed his instructions. Papai died only in 2020 after an eventful life. He managed to serve 23 years in prison for confessing to 257 contract killings and participating in the planning of over 3,000 murders, write his memoirs, run a YouTube channel, and even, in modern times, after his release, found himself back in prison. He extorted prominent individuals previously linked to the cartel, like Jorge Ochoa, hoping to acquire money. However, he achieved nothing, and in 2020, he died in prison. Less known is the armed faction of the Medellín Cartel called El Prisca, led by the Prisca brothers Armando Alberto Eneas, El Negra, José Rodolfo, and David Ricardo. In 1980, Ricardo Prisca, also known as Sina, was arrested and convicted of car theft. After his release, he was recruited by the Medellín Cartel on Escobar's orders. At its peak, the group numbered around 100 professional fighters. Ricardo Prisca, in the spirit of all Medellín members, was popular among the common residents of his neighborhood, Aranjuez. He opened an account at the local supermarket for those who could not afford food and also paid for the university studies of local children. A statue of the Blessed Virgin of Carmen was installed in the brothers' house, and, as witnesses recount, they would recite their prayers together before every operation. There were many operations. The Priscas were involved in all major cartel activities, and they are credited with no fewer than 200 political contract killings. Their names appeared in the press after the assassination of the Minister of Justice, forcing them to leave Medellín. The criminal group was gradually dismantled from 1987 to 1991. In 1991, Ricardo Prisca died on the same day as his brother, as a result of two separate police operations conducted in Medellín and Rio Negro. Thus, by 1982, everything was running smoothly for the Medellín faction. The cartel's production centers were located in the southern part of the country, in the eastern plains in the departments of Meta and Caqueta. Here operated one of the world's largest full-cycle cocaine production and processing centers, known as Tranquilandia. The Medellín faction released precisely the amount of merchandise needed to prevent prices from dropping, yielding fabulous profits. By 1982, a kilogram of cocaine in Medellín was purchased for $8,000, while in Miami it sold for $42,000. Simultaneously, Americans began to shut down the Bahamian transport route, and Norman's Cay, under Lehder's leadership, no longer guaranteed the necessary flow of traffic. Drug traffickers began seeking alternatives and eventually found a route through Mexico. More details on this are provided in our video about the Guadalajara cartel. Within the scope of this story, we'll simply mention that there was enough cocaine for everyone, both Colombians and Mexicans. Furthermore, the opening of Mexican channels led to an oversupply in the market, and the price per kilogram predictably dropped. But already after the described events, this would lead to the appearance on U.S. streets of a new drug called crack, which would not only become a true marginalized symbol of the American ghetto, but also bring the Medellín cartel even more astonishing profits. Incidentally, an interesting fact. In Colombia itself, cocaine was not particularly popular in the 1980s. Firstly, despite the price decrease, it remained expensive for the average Colombian. And secondly, Colombians had turned to smoking cocaine paste bazooka, which had an instant addictive effect and a devastating impact. Carlos Lehder and Griselda Blanco were also victims of bazooka. One of the few constraining factors for the Medellín drug lords was the extradition law. This 1979 bilateral agreement between the United States and Colombia had been ratified by both parties by 1981, but at the time, few paid it much heed. The news didn't even make front-page headlines and, seemingly, didn't concern Colombia at all. However, by 1982, the cocaine kings, with their organization's growth, realized the agreement directly impacted them. The primary threat lay in Article 8. Persons involved in drug smuggling are subject to extradition to the United States, even if they have never left Colombian territory. It was only necessary to prove that these individuals posed a danger to the United States, meaning they supplied drugs there, and each of them, in one way or another, had already fallen under the DEA's scrutiny, which, however, did not fully comprehend how much this organization had grown, or that it was, in fact, a cohesive group, not a loose collection of local potentates who could be dismantled separately. Article 8 of the extradition law meant that American prosecutors could request the extradition of anyone involved in drug trafficking. In the early 1980s, following the battles on Miami streets, which went down in history as the Cocaine Cowboy Wars, DEA agents began operating on Colombian territory. The DEA understood that major traffickers feared American prisons like fire and therefore preferred to operate from the safety of Colombia. The names of drug trafficking leaders such as Carlos Lehder gradually began to appear in sensational newspaper headlines. Yet, for many years, they had diligently amassed their fortunes in the shadows. In Colombia at that time, the far-left terrorist group M19 operated, one of whose activities was the kidnapping of wealthy entrepreneurs for ransom. On November 12, 1981, Marta Nieves Ochoa Vásquez, a member of the Ochoa clan, was kidnapped upon leaving university. For her release, the M19 demanded $12 million from the cartel. However, in response, the Ochoa brothers created a special armed detachment called Death to Kidnappers, MAS, which began exterminating the rebels. Among the militants killed by the cartel were one of the M19 leaders, Guillermo Helvecio Ruiz, and all his relatives. In February 1982, the rebels released Marta Ochoa, effectively conceding their defeat, and made peace with the cartel. As a result of the war, the M19 was driven out of the populous and wealthy department of Antioquia. This case was the first, but not the last, instance where the Medellín faction would employ paramilitary formations. Moreover, in the future, the M19 would guard laboratories and commit contract killings for the Medellín cartel. In that same year, 1981, the Colombian cocaine kings organized a summit on the Caribbean coast near Barranquilla. This was the location of Jorge Ochoa's ranch, the Veracruz Hacienda. On the agenda was the matter of further expanding the cocaine business. The Ochoa clan had accumulated so much cocaine that they sought newer and more numerous routes for transporting the drug abroad. Carlos Lehder was invited as an honored guest to the meeting. His positions on Norman's Cay were still strong, but he, like the others, understood that the small islet's capacity no longer met the surging demand in the American market. The traffickers lacked planes, pilots, and, most importantly, new smuggling routes. In Veracruz, the young narco-controllers at a previous meeting had also presented their own plans for organizing new routes and distribution markets. In 1980, Ochoa had installed a long-range radio navigation system in Pocandia, northwestern Colombia, near the Panamanian border. Thanks to this system, all flights could originate from the airstrip of the Veracruz Hacienda. Over a mile long, the runway was suitable even for large cargo planes. They discussed joint shipments, dividing tasks to maximize control over drug trafficking. The cartel grew visibly, but it would only transform into a truly international organization a few years later, when the collaboration between Escobar, Gacha, and Ochoa would assume unprecedented scale, and Mexican godfather Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo would fully integrate into the business, in some ways freeing their hands, as they had to focus less on transport and more on their own security. Because the strengthening of this alliance within the country was accompanied by incessant bloodshed. The Medellín police were powerless to stop the violence and murders. By 1981, the city had become the fiefdom of the cocaine kings. Police and politicians accepted bribes and remained silent. Otherwise, death awaited them. The law of plata o plomo, silver or lead, became the norm. Old-school smugglers no longer had a place in the new system. They, with rare exceptions, peacefully ceded ground to the competition from the younger generation. They lacked cunning and will. Most retired, and others resigned themselves to their positions, leaving the business to their children and grandchildren. A handful of rebellious forces were forced to yield or were simply removed from their path. A new era of drug trafficking began. Instead of individuals, there was a gang. Nevertheless, the city teemed with suspicious individuals squandering money left and right, So the daily expenditures of the cocaine kings in the early 1980s did not particularly stand out. Money flowed into the city like a river, and they spent it in competition. Initially, it was quite difficult to distinguish the wealthy. Pablo Escobar, for example, adored car racing and fielded an entire team with complete equipment and cars in city competitions. Rodríguez Gacha became the unofficial patron and primary employer of his native Pacho. The Ochoa clan continued the old business of breeding horses and fighting bulls, but on an unprecedented scale. The Ochoa's horses garnered admiration among connoisseurs worldwide and were even used in European advertisements. The Ochoas literally bought out the entire niche related to cari, a popular pastime in Colombia. The passions that burned in this business were even dubbed by the press as the Medellín Cartel of cari. They crushed all competitors, the peaceful owners of bull breeding ranches, to become monopolists. A criminal case related to Spanish fighting bulls would later allow Jorge to return to Colombia. But more on that later. Carlos Lehder constructed a hotel in Armenia called La Posada Alemana, the German Inn. It featured 24 luxurious Swiss-style rooms, a restaurant, a conference center, a nightclub with a panoramic terrace, a mini-zoo with lions, and a wine cellar boasting a collection of fine wines from around the world. In front of the hotel stood a striking monument to a nude John Lennon, touching which before a trip was considered good luck among smugglers. Later acquired residential homes, state institution buildings, and private businesses in his native Armenia, leading to widespread real estate speculation and a threefold increase in land prices. He was often seen strolling through the city in a black uniform adorned with a swastika on his sleeve, from which his stride was recorded in the Nazi salute. Later also developed a passion for publishing. He owned his own newspaper, printed in enormous circulations, titled El Condor Libre, the Free Condor. It was printed with green ink and proclaimed the marijuana civilization, with a subtle Nazi undertone. Pablo Escobar, incidentally, was not particularly fond of Lehder due to his now evident addiction to smoking bazooka. Moreover, Lehder would utter nonsense at every turn. Sometimes he would shout fascist slogans. Other times he would boast of having donated a substantial sum to the Liberal Party to support presidential candidates. Thus, he publicly linked his name, and along with it, the names of his fellow smugglers, to the Colombian political system, which is why he appeared in newspaper headlines more frequently. Naturally, the cartel sought to influence high-level authorities, but only Lehder ostentatiously boasted about it, drawing attention. Escobar referred to him as nothing less than Bocon, meaning big mouth, but his contacts and connections remained important to the organization. Lehder, of course, behaved recklessly, but Escobar outdid everyone. It's no coincidence that he became, in the eyes of the public, the formal leader of the entire organization. In the 1982 elections, in the style of "bosses want power," he officially entered the Colombian Congress for the district of Envigado as an alternate. When the primary representative of Envigado was ill or simply absent, Escobar would fill in. The drug trafficker had become a congressman. Escobar and Ortega supported Senator Alberto Santofimio, one of the pillars of the Liberal Party, who possessed colossal power and influence. Santofimio, the cocaine king's favored politician, became a symbol of the corruption within the Colombian political system. President Turbay Ayala's term was drawing to a close, as 1982 was to be an election year, and the drug traffickers continued to be bothered by the extradition law, which prevented them from operating at full capacity. At one of the meetings, Rodríguez Gacha made it clear that his contacts in the opposition party reported good news. The Conservative Party candidate, Belisario Betancourt, had personally confirmed to one of their lawyers that, if he won, he had no intention of extraditing Colombian citizens to the United States. However, Escobar had connections in another party and was backing the liberals. Carlos Lehder, in his book, recounts how the entire cartel threw its weight behind abolishing extradition. This episode is interesting from the perspective of the joint efforts of each member of the criminal organization. Pablo secured a seat in Congress as Ortega's alternate and began supporting candidate Lopez's campaign. As difficult as it may be to understand today, We, experienced criminals, had not fully grasped the game of political leaders. They had just approved a treaty in Congress that could expel us from our homeland, yet at the same time, they wanted our financial support and votes. Pablo arranged a meeting with candidate Lopez. Lopez agreed on the condition that the meeting be held confidentially in an intercontinental hotel room. The night before, Pablo Escobar summoned everyone to his office. 6 other leaders arrived: Jorge Luis Ochoa, Gustavo Gaviria, Pablo Carré, Alonso Denas, Rodrigo Murillo, and El Mexicano. He proposed an initial donation of $100,000 from each. Then, Lopez arrived and confidently declared that the extradition treaty would currently remain under review, and he did not believe it would be applied in the near future. Pablo subtly mentioned the donation they were to make to him and stated that support would continue. A couple of days later, I received a call from a distraught Pablo Escobar. "Come on, Carlos, I need your help. These politicians have already betrayed us. Carlos, it can't go on like this. They don't know who they're dealing with. They stole $800,000 from us and are now laughing in our faces. Do something, Carlos." It turned out that the press reported Lopez's electoral headquarters had assured that he had held a press conference to detail the support for this Bogotá politician. At the press conference, Lehder explained to journalists that honest and caring businessmen had presented presidential candidate Alfonso Lopez with a donation equivalent to $800,000 as a protest against extradition. The next day, the news was in all the newspapers. The Conservative Party was delighted with the revelation of the meeting. Rodríguez Gacha stated that he, along with other Pacho traders, had donated nearly $1 million to the Conservatives. And, as Lehder notes, it was Gacha's bet that won. The eagerly awaited election day arrived, and candidate Belisario Betancur won by a wide margin. The new president declared that he would not visit Washington as long as he was president of the Republic. For the Medellín Cartel, this was a strong and reassuring signal that the extradition treaty would not be implemented during his administration. However, they rejoiced too soon, because the Americans, in the meantime, were not dormant. They began with the cartel's most conspicuous figure, Carlos Lehder. His narcotic euphoria led to nothing good. Norman's Cay became a veritable den, and the owner himself developed paranoia and megalomania. On March 11, 1983, Lehder founded the Latin Nationalist Movement, a new political party with an ultranationalist and neo-Nazi aura. Its fundamental objective was the immediate repeal of the extradition treaty between the United States and Mexico. Shortly thereafter, Norman's Cay had to be abandoned, and soon after it was raided, and all of Carlos's accounts were frozen. Among all those subject to extradition, the American ambassador designated Lehder as the #1 figure. He was the primary target for American law enforcement. Lehder was acutely aware of the threat. He could be expelled not only from Colombia, but also from any country with which the United States had a bilateral agreement on the extradition of criminals. Already in 1982, Lehder had dispatched his men to the U.S. State Department to test the waters and had personally met with a DEA agent in Colombia. He had offered to sell Norman's Cay to the United States for $5 million if they would close the case. "A military base wouldn't displease you, would it?" Lehder then said meaningfully. He was, of course, refused. Carlos's insolence and audacity knew no bounds. In late July, he gave an interview to Bogotá's Caracol Radio, declaring that he had purchased his islands in the Bahamas for over $1 million, and they have since faithfully served the most profitable Colombian enterprises. Without uttering the word cocaine, he confessed to handling the transport of goods for friends. His arrest and detention in an American prison were also explained very simply. He, Lehder, in his youth, led the Latin Americans throughout the district, was a chief who defended his race, his principles, his Colombian origin. He wanted to represent the workers and the poorest of the poor in the Senate. "They say I conspired against the United States. I'll say more. I intend to harm them until they repeal the expulsion law." Furthermore, Lehder acquired a printing press and a team of journalists who published a proclamation, the newspaper of the Latin Nationalist Movement, in which Carlos was declared almost a messiah. and proposed to pay Colombia's national debt to the United States and declared drug trafficking a crusade against capitalism. But his crazy and provocative grandstanding yielded no results. On September 2, 1983, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the United States, recognizing Lehder as subject to extradition. An arrest warrant was signed for him in Colombia, but Carlos learned of it in time and went into hiding. However, by approving Lehder's extradition order, the new Minister of Justice Lara Bonilla, who would yet play a tragic role in this story, forwarded it to President Betancourt for signature. Then great misfortune befell El Mexicano. I've already mentioned the largest enterprise named Tranquilandia. After openly supporting Betancourt in the election campaign, Gacha had become a genuine hero and had never attracted undue attention from the DEA. Thus, no one would have ever found him had it not been for the ether necessary for the production of pure cocaine hydrochloride and a group of meticulous Americans. On February 9, 1984, the entire cartel gathered at a nightclub in the mountains above Medellín. One of Miami's main distributors, part of the Ochoa network, was celebrating the birth of his son. The godfather was Jorge Ochoa himself. The festivities lasted for a week, and throughout this time, the cartel leaders discussed pressing issues. As always, they were concerned with expanding their markets. They sought to increase the number of routes and pilots under continually evolving conditions. For 6 months, their joint complex named Tranquilandia had been operating in the jungle. There, up to 4,000 kilograms of drugs were produced monthly. Many tons of cocaine had accumulated in the forests, and the new complex required an uninterrupted supply and absorbed tons upon tons of raw materials, the most important of which was ether. Ether is essential in the final stage of the lengthy chemical process of cocaine production. To obtain cocaine powder suitable for inhalation, cocaine base, derived from cocaine paste, is dissolved in ether with the addition of hydrochloric acid and acetone. Then the resulting mass is filtered, dried, and cocaine hydrochloride is obtained, the very white powder regularly consumed in 1984 by 5 million Americans. To produce 1 kilogram of cocaine, 17 liters of ether are required. Ether was not produced in Colombia, at least not in the quantities needed by drug traffickers, so they ordered it from abroad. Learning this simple fact, Americans began monitoring the flows of imported ether into Colombia, rightly reasoning that a ban on ether imports would severely impact producers. Thus, they traced a local legal ether buyer who purchased twice as much as was legally used in all of Colombia in a year, and they equipped 2 barrels from the batch with radio signaling devices the size of a cigarette pack, along with a powerful power supply designed for long duration. A false bottom separated this entire structure from the ether. The first signal arrived from New Orleans, from where the barrels headed towards the outskirts of Barranquilla, directly to the famous Veracruz hacienda, located within the extensive holdings of the Ochoa clan. After some time, the ether left Veracruz and was transported by plane southward. And the next signal came from the dense jungles of eastern Colombia. This was the destination. An assault team of 42 people set off for the operation and managed to catch the narco-barons by surprise. No resistance was offered. The subsequent discovery revealed new and ever-increasing dimensions of the Medellín faction's activities. It was not merely the main laboratory, but a veritable factory with a complete cocaine production cycle. It fed and clothed approximately 100 people. There were generators, showers, washing machines, and dryers. Near the airstrip, police counted 305 barrels of acetone, 363 of ether, 482 canisters of red gasoline, 133 canisters of aviation fuel. In short, enormous stocks of raw materials. It soon became clear what they were intended for. According to the flight log, abandoned from December 1983 to February 1984, this improvised airport had received 15,000 tons of paste and cocaine base. And then cocaine was discovered, 2 tons of cocaine in various states of aggregation. Soon journalists arrived and Colombian television broadcast the largest cocaine seizure in history. None of them had ever seen so much drug. It was then that the name of the camp Tranquilandia leaked out. Next to it was Cocolan, and even Cocolan II under construction. Probably each of the camps belonged to different bosses. A guerrilla camp was also discovered, belonging to the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC. Obviously, the guerrillas were guarding cocaine production. In half a month, almost 14 tons of cocaine went up in smoke, and with them, 14 laboratories and camps, 7 planes, and 11 barrels of ether and other chemicals. Colombian authorities calculated that in 2 years, these laboratories had yielded cocaine traffickers $12 billion in net profit. The destroyed camps, along with the burned cocaine, caused a loss 10 times smaller. After the DEA raid, Colombian authorities understood that the Medellín Cartel was no longer collecting loads from everywhere from small home laboratories. The existence of Tranquilandia indicated that it was not a random discovery, but a genuine factory, and the others would be no less significant. Perhaps there were already dozens or even hundreds. Furthermore, the facts indicated that all this belonged to the Medellín faction. The ether at the Veracruz ranch led directly to the Ochoa clan. But the biggest revelation was Rodríguez Gacha's involvement in the enterprise. He turned out to be a full co-owner of the laboratories found in the jungle. This was indicated by a destroyed plane discovered on one of the airstrips in the dense forests. The owner of the plane was Justo Pastor Rodríguez Gacha, El Mexicano's brother. The next signal came from the town of Leticia, where rumors spread that Rodríguez Gacha was completely bankrupt following the Tranquilandia raid. Apparently, already by mid-December 1983, he had begun transferring cocaine paste and bases from Peru to Tranquilandia, investing colossal sums. Rodríguez Gacha's financial collapse clearly confirmed that he was a partner of the Medellín Cartel. Thus, the entire leadership of the criminal organization came under the scrutiny of law enforcement. On the eve of the raid, the price of a kilogram of cocaine in Miami for wholesale purchases was $14,000. After the raid, it instantly surged. For the first time in the past 3 years, a cocaine shortage emerged and anti-drug fighters rejoiced. The raid undoubtedly inflicted damage on the cartel. But the story does not end there. Lara Bonilla, the Minister of Justice, persistently attacked the nascent Congressman Escobar on the political front, and Escobar responded, for now, within reasonable limits. The outcome of their heated debates in the legal arena was Pablo's withdrawal from the world of grand politics in early 1984. This marked the beginning of the end. First, Tranquilandia, which exposed the entire composition of the Medellín Cartel, then Pablo's renunciation of parliamentary immunity, Carlos Lehder's continuous revelations in the press, and his almost open admission of cocaine trafficking. The beautiful facade that the Medellín faction had so long constructed receded, revealing their brutal nature. The bloodshed on Colombia's streets was about to begin. On April 30th, Lara Bonilla was assassinated in his car while returning home. Several hitmen participated in the crime, of whom only one survived. The chain of command for these sicarios, paid killers, was so long that investigations in the capture of the culprits made little progress. Everyone suspected both Lehder and Ochoa, but ultimately it was most likely an impulsive decision by Pablo Escobar, frustrated by his political failure, that activated the chain of numerous militants at the cartel's service. The war between traffickers and politicians began that night. On April 30th, 1984, President Belisario Betancourt ordered the ruthless prosecution of both the Medellín Cartel leaders and their accomplices. That same night, the criminals fled Colombia and arrived in Panama to Carlos Lehder, under the protection of Panama's shadowy leader, Manuel Noriega, who had been directly involved in their affairs since 1982, providing a transit point for transportation. Noriega took the exiles under his wing. He provided the cartel leaders with bodyguards and offered them useful advice. Ochoa rented a house near the Marriott Hotel. Escobar lived in hotels in Valle and Bombita, or in a festive tavern. Escobar's asylum alone cost $1 million. This money ended up in Noriega's pockets. Under Noriega's protection, the cartel played a double game with the long-term goal of restoring its former power. On one hand, the traffickers established a massive laboratory in Panama's Darien jungles and intended to create similar ones in Nicaragua. But on the other hand, they were not averse to reconciling with the Colombian government, hoping that the past would be forgotten and all their sins forgiven. The Medellín faction sent, through an intermediary, a lengthy 6-page letter to Belisario Betancourt. They called this extraordinary message a unilateral declaration, emphasizing the honesty and frankness of their position, and asked the president to consider the possibility of their reintegration into Colombian society. In the first part, the authors briefly outlined the history of drug trafficking in Colombia. It stated that our organizations today control 70 to 80% of the total volume of cocaine produced in the country and generate approximately $2 billion in annual revenue. This was followed by the assurance that the organizations we represent bear no direct or indirect responsibility for the murder of Lara Bonilla. Furthermore, the traffickers disassociated themselves from politics, declaring that changing the existing democratic and republican system in Colombia was not among their plans. In the second part of the memorandum, the government was offered an agreement. On their part, the cocaine kings collectively pledged to surrender all secret airports and laboratories to the state, disband the cartel, put their money into circulation in Colombia, provide assistance in planting agricultural crops instead of coca and marijuana, and collaborate with the government in campaigns to eradicate drug addiction and treat drug addicts in the country. In return, the traffickers wanted Betancourt to annul the state of siege, introduced after Bonilla's assassination, and agree not to extradite to the United States criminals who had violated the law before this significant letter. In other words, the cartel demanded amnesty. The drug traffickers received $2 billion annually and kept it out of the country. The unpunished return of the smugglers meant the return of an incredible amount of money to the Colombian economy. The country was offered a colossal bribe. The cartel members received no response from Betancourt or anyone else and continued to hide in Panama, gradually losing their millions. On June 15, 1984, at Miami Airport, customs intercepted 1.2 tons of cocaine, packed in boxes labeled perfumes. The perfumes were located in the refrigerated compartments of a cargo plane belonging to a Panamanian airline that leased aircraft. A week later, Panamanian agents confiscated 6,000 tanks of ether in the Panama Canal area. Noriega was also playing a double game. While effectively emperors in their homeland, in Panama, the Medellín faction found themselves defenseless. They were plagued by misfortunes and sensational scandals. It became evident that the cartel would have to leave Panama. Neither Escobar nor Ochoa felt secure outside Colombia. Both knew that ultimately the safest place would be at home, where they could always buy the protection of the powerful and hire assassins to keep enemies at bay. But Betancourt had no intention of yielding. In Lara Bonilla's place, he appointed another fighter against the narco-mafia, Enrique Parejo González, as Minister of Justice. Parejo was unyielding, like Lara Bonilla, but unlike the deceased minister, he could now count on Betancourt's support. By the end of the summer, the United States had requested the extradition of over 60 Colombian defendants in drug smuggling cases. And finally, on August 14th, the Supreme Court judge in Bogotá, Manuel Castro Gil, brought preliminary charges against 10 suspects in the murder of Lara Bonilla, and among the alleged masterminds were Jorge Ochoa and Gonzalo Rodríguez Gacha. Lehder represented special value for the authorities. Unlike Escobar, Ochoa, and Rodríguez Gacha, who were hiding in Panama, Lehder had returned to Colombia and was having fun with the guerrillas in the forests, becoming the primary person responsible for the laboratories and the uninterrupted production of merchandise. He was the only one for whom Betancourt signed the extradition order to the United States, and Lehder no longer had the right to appeal. If Carlos were arrested, he could be quietly placed on a plane and sent to the United States without any bureaucracy. In February 1985, Lehder gave an interview to Spanish television in one of his jungle hideouts. Shaven, disheveled, dressed in camouflage pants and a black vest, He told journalists that he intended to create an army of 5,000 men to defend national independence, that the problem of extraditing criminals to the United States had become a problem of national liberation, and that Lara Bonilla had been killed by the people themselves before the minister, with the help of the imperialists, managed to send many Colombians to trial in the United States. Lehder considered himself a symbol of all fighters against imperialism and asserted that in this struggle the end justifies the means. Meanwhile, by late 1984, the Medellín Cartel had partially regained its former power and influence. Everything had truly quieted down, and they were able to return home. Pablo Escobar and Gonzalo Rodríguez Gacha calmly set about re-establishing the network of producers and distributors. Lehder remained in the jungle. As for Jorge Ochoa, nothing had been heard of him since May. His brothers managed the networks in Colombia, but Jorge seemed to have vanished after an extremely confusing and complicated incident with the smuggler informant Barry Seal, whose testimonies and photographs stripped Jorge of his image as an exemplary horse breeder from Antioquia. And not only that, Seal had found evidence of the cartel's ties to the Nicaraguan Contras, who in turn were President Reagan's worst enemies, and Reagan began to stir if even a single shot was heard somewhere. In 1986, approximately in July or early August, Ochoa emigrated to Spain, with which he had long-standing ties for his horse-breeding business and cartel affairs. He appeared in Madrid under the name Moisés Morena Miranda, with a slightly altered appearance. Ochoa traveled the country with his wife and made an exclusively respectable impression. But Colombians always had bad luck abroad, especially Jorge. Shortly after his arrival, Ochoa's wife began depositing substantial sums of dollars in local banks. In one of Madrid's most luxurious neighborhoods, they bought an 8,000-square-foot estate with a swimming pool, tennis courts, warehouse, and discotheque. 4 Mercedes cars were in the garage. Ochoa enrolled his son in an American school with bilingual instruction. In late August, through secret channels, information reached the Spanish Special Prosecutor's Office for the Prevention and Eradication of Drug Trafficking that Morena Miranda was not who he claimed to be. An investigation was conducted, and it was soon understood that Morena Miranda was a smuggler who wanted to settle in Spain. On September 25th, the police discovered his true name and intercepted 5 phone calls. Ochoa called Colombia, London, Panama, and Belgium. The police informed the DEA resident in Madrid, who telegraphed Washington. The Department of Justice prepared an extradition request for Ochoa in connection with the Nicaraguan case. The request was sent to the U.S. Embassy in Madrid, and on October 17th, the ambassador delivered a copy of the documents to the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The United States demanded Ochoa's arrest. Spanish police had been following him for several months. The scope of his activities was terrifyingly vast. In November, it was learned that Ochoa intended to purchase over 4,000 hectares of land in southern Spain. Police feared he would use this ranch to transform Spain into an international cocaine distribution hub. On November 15, 1984, Spanish police arrested Ochoa along with his wife and froze all their bank accounts. DEA agents ensured Ochoa's son was removed from the American school. For the Reagan administration, Jorge Ochoa's arrest proved to be a godsend. Less than 4 months had passed since the U.S. government had labeled Ochoa and other Medellín Cartel members as allies of Nicaragua's Marxist government, and now an excellent opportunity arose to bring Ochoa to the United States for trial. The Spanish were ready to cooperate. Although they had never dealt with international drug trafficking, they were tired of all sorts of terrorism and ideological extremism, and Ochoa's ties to Nicaragua's Marxist government had, in their eyes, clear political connotations. The United States also illustrated to the Spanish Ochoa's connection to Tranquilandia, guarded by M19 guerrillas, who were also communists. All of this, cocaine, terrorism, Marxism, coalesced for the Spanish into a threefold nightmare for the free world. In Spain, they announced that Ochoa had been detained under special anti-terrorism laws, and this entailed a review of the charges brought against him. Shortly after Ochoa's arrest and detention in a Madrid prison, the United States officially requested his extradition on charges in the Nicaraguan case. Subsequently, Colombia requested Ochoa's extradition on charges of falsifying a document, specifically a license for the importation of 128 Spanish bulls into Cartagena in 1981. That is, Ochoa was again accused of smuggling. Initially, the United States had a stronger chance of obtaining Ochoa. Drug smuggling was more severe than bull smuggling, and the U.S. extradition requests were filed before Colombia's. The Spanish government tried to nullify these advantages or outmaneuver the opponent in some other way. Not even half a year passed before Colombia again requested Ochoa's extradition. This time, the request came from Medellín. His compatriots wished to try him for the same Nicaraguan operation on the grounds that criminal proceedings had already been initiated against Ochoa in Miami. And what actually happened was this. A close friend of Jorge Ochoa found access to judicial records in Miami, made photocopies of the Nicaraguan indictment, and sent them to the Medellín District Court. Consequently, on one side of the scale was an American request, and on the other, two Colombian requests. Ochoa was accused by his homeland, and one of the charges completely coincided with the Miami indictment. Furthermore, the prosecutors made a grave error by conflating terrorism, communism, and drugs, and the defense did not fail to capitalize on it. Many Spaniards considered their Spanish police, and even more so Reagan's DEA, ardent anti-communists who would attribute anything to the Sandinistas, even indict them for drug trafficking, simply to discredit them. And Ochoa's lawyers quickly understood that the jury's political sympathies could be exploited. They condemned Reagan for waging a dirty war against Nicaragua and portrayed their client as a pawn in a dishonest political game. However, the prosecutors also resorted to various small stratagems. Once, news quickly spread throughout the country that Ochoa's friends had attempted a daring prison break, trying to snatch him by helicopter. A few days later, some police sources reported to the Spanish news agency that Ochoa had attempted to bribe the police officers conducting the investigation. In this story, Ochoa was depicted as the viceroy of the global cocaine business, the second man after Escobar, which once again convinces us of who truly led the Medellín Cartel. It is not known for certain. The Ochoa case was discussed in the criminal chamber of the Spanish National Court. The court examined the presented material for nearly 9 months. Ochoa pleaded guilty to illegally importing bulls into Colombia, but categorically denied his participation in drug smuggling and declared that he would not stand trial for drug trafficking either in Colombia or in the United States. The defense stubbornly emphasized the political undertones of the accusations and sought in every way to discredit the U.S. case. They argued that the indictment was ridiculous, as it was based on the testimony of Barry Seal, a hardened criminal and liar. Essentially, Seal was the main and only witness for the prosecution. The defense, however, had to concede the testimonies of 2 other DEA agents linked to Barry Seal. They merely relayed Seal's testimonies, but according to Spanish law, second-hand testimonies held legal value. Thus, the prosecution now had not 1, but 3 testimonies. Ochoa's extradition hearing before the National Court of Spain was set for September 17, 1985. During the hearing, the Spanish treated Ochoa like an arrested Basque separatist. He was considered an exceptionally dangerous criminal with exceptionally dangerous friends, and there were likely valid reasons for this. In the courtroom, the public was separated from judges, defense attorneys, and prosecutor by a 3-foot wooden panel and a floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass partition. This usually deterred political activists from firing shots or throwing grenades during hearings. 3 judges observed the room from atop a wooden platform. The defendant sat before them on a low bench with his back to the glass, separating the public from the trial participants. Many Colombians were in the room, including members of the Ochoa family. Initially, there was noise and a vague discontent hung in the air, but as soon as the judges entered, the audience immediately quieted. Ochoa, dressed in a dark suit, sat calmly between 2 uniformed police officers. He had lost a lot of weight and looked well-groomed, with neatly trimmed hair, a young and accomplished Colombian businessman, a horse breeder. The case hearing lasted approximately 3 hours. After closing the session, the judges deliberated for an entire week and on September 24th delivered their verdict. The United States' request was unanimously rejected due to its political undertones. Ochoa was to go to Colombia and face trial for bull importation. Ochoa's lawyers won by countering Barry Seal with anti-imperialist rhetoric and demonstrating a willingness to surrender their client to Colombia. But the prosecutors appealed, and incredibly, on January 21, 1986, the court re-examined its decision and agreed to extradite Ochoa to the United States. This time, the strained relations between the United States and Nicaragua were not a reason to refuse the criminal's extradition. Ochoa was accused of drug smuggling, and this is not a political crime. The defense immediately appealed the court's decision, and already in Cartagena, where Jorge Ochoa had returned, he was sentenced to 20 months in prison, released on bail in 1987. He would enter Forbes' top 20 wealthiest people in the world with $3 billion, honestly earned from thoroughbred horses and fighting bulls. The bail amounted to a mere $11,500. The reunification of the Medellín Cartel unleashed a wave of political terror targeting the Colombian state. The drug lords formed the group Los Extraditables, which threatened all politicians who opposed the abolition of extradition. Car bombs, assassinations of judges, police officers, and random victims on the streets simply overwhelmed Colombia. A particular cruelty among all the inhumane acts was the occupation of the Palace of Justice by M19 militants, the very same who had previously kidnapped Ochoa and later controlled cocaine laboratories under Carlos Lehder's guidance. They were given $2 million for the attack by the cartel. However, Lehder himself, in his memoirs, strongly denied Pablo Escobar's and, naturally, the Medellín Cartel's participation. According to his version, neither Pablo Escobar nor I ever knew in advance of the M19's plans to storm the Palace of Justice. Moreover, in my opinion, this type of guerrilla operation for assaulting and occupying a target does not require large monetary expenditures, as armed guerrillas do not receive salaries and are not contracted mercenaries. A war of all against all began on the streets of Medellín, and when the police joined in, a true bloodbath ensued. For more details on why and how the police became a target for drug traffickers, watch our video on Pablo Escobar. Violence in those years became a part of daily life for the Medellín faction. In 1985, 1,698 murders were recorded here, the highest per capita rate for a state where a total of 11,000 murders occurred in the same year, also far more than in any other country not affected by civil war. But 1986 surpassed all grim records, 3,500 murders, 10 every day. The primary cause of death for men aged 15 to 40 was homicide. Out of 1,455 cases recorded in the city in the first 6 months, 80% were committed with firearms. In 1987, Carlos Lehder was finally captured in the jungle. In desperation, he even wrote a letter to George Bush requesting a deal. His trial hearings lasted 7 months, and George Young, who seized the opportunity to take revenge on his former friend, who had screwed him over sometime after their collaboration began, participated with great pleasure. As Young himself states, he testified against Carlos with Escobar's permission. Presumably, Escobar himself called him in prison, knowing that Lehder was ready to spill the beans on everyone. George recounted story after story, revealing new details about the creation of the Medellín Cartel. He called it the most significant event of his life, when all the years spent were revealed in detail for entertainment. In the end, Carlos Lehder was found guilty of all cocaine trafficking charges. Here's what he himself says. Of course, I was 100% guilty of all charges of trafficking many tons of cocaine. I was a smuggler. I was an international trafficker who penetrated through land, sea, and even U.S. airspace, transporting South American cocaine. It was my dangerous profession. And as a member of the Medellín Cartel, my mission and duty were that of a Colombian drug trafficker whom the Drug Enforcement Administration pursued for many years. Carlos Lehder was sentenced to 135 years in prison. After a year in solitary confinement, his eyesight drastically weakened. But then, as with George, an opportunity arose. The United States invaded Panama, capturing the treacherous Noriega. Later testified against him, again, presumably with Pablo Escobar's consent. According to this version, Carlos wrote him a letter asking to testify against the Medellín Cartel and its ties to Noriega, receiving a positive response and a promise that no one in his family would be harmed. Escobar kept his promise and later found hope. For the deal, his sentence was reduced to 55 years, of which he served 33 from beginning to end, working for most of the time in the prison cafeteria. In the summer of 2020, he was released and deported to his second homeland, Germany, where he still lives today. This year, he published a book about his life titled Life and Death of the Medellín Cartel. The La Posada Alemana Hotel, after 19 years, transformed into a massive open-air brothel where John Lennon enthusiasts gathered. Currently, the area of La Posada Alemana has been converted into a family recreational park, and the famous statue has disappeared in an unknown direction. And now, let us return to the 1980s. Lehder's arrest did not affect his colleagues' activities in the slightest, apart from Jorge Ochoa, who, after his Spanish adventures, temporarily retreated into the shadows, leaving the reins to his brothers. He managed to get out of court on bail, and from that moment on, it was as if he no longer participated in the cartel. Essentially, only the two most ruthless members remained, Escobar and Rodríguez Gacha. El Mexicano definitively solidified his role as the Minister of War of the Medellín Cartel, becoming Escobar's main ally and supporter during the war against the state. In 1989, he commanded a group of 1,000 armed men, at the core of which was an elite unit of 70 chosen hitmen, involved in numerous bloody episodes, including the assassination of Luis Carlos Galán, a principled presidential candidate whom Gacha considered a personal enemy. The escalation of violence culminated in the bombing of an airplane in 1989. Escobar and Gacha surmised that a prominent politician would be on board, but he changed his mind at the last moment and survived. The victims of the explosion were 110 innocent people, and this horrific incident marked the beginning of the hunt for Escobar and Gacha. In late 1989, Rodríguez Gacha was tracked down through an informant named Navegante, the closest person to Gacha, who betrayed his master. He reported that Gacha, his son Freddy Gonzalo, and several bodyguards were in Cartagena. When DEA police learned of this, they dispatched 30 elite Special Forces personnel to the Air Force Command in Barranquilla. Orders were given to have 2 police helicopters ready for takeoff from Santa Marta Airport. Thus began the military operation with the telling name Apocalypse. On Thursday evening, Gacha, who realized he had been discovered, along with his son and 5 bodyguards, boarded a speedboat and headed to the El Toro farm, located between Coveñas and Tolú. Thereafter, authorities lost sight of him. But thanks to the informant, an aerial search began in the area to find the boat. It was located at dawn, but only one man was on board who admitted to dropping Gacha off at the Tolú farm. Where do the militants go to save their master? Upon arrival, they see only a parked pickup truck and fly in another direction. At the same moment, the pickup truck departs. A shootout begins. The fugitives dispersed and Gacha, climbing over a barbed wire fence, nearly tore off his scalp. But then he watched his son die, and at the same moment, he was wounded in the leg. The next bullet struck his head. The impact was so severe that identification by fingerprints was necessary. There is a version that Gacha, seeing his son's death, committed suicide by holding a grenade to his face, but this is nothing more than a legend. If he had done so, the grenade would have also torn off his arm. Gacha's funeral was attended by several thousand people from his native municipality of Pacho, but popular affection did not prevent the grateful villagers from looting his Casa Gacha estate, from which they took absolutely everything, and even blew up the swimming pools in search of hidden treasures. And in our modern era, this still sturdy structure has been purchased by China for the opening of one of the largest embassies in Latin America. In another of El Mexicano's plundered estates, Cuernavaca, today stands a dog shelter, and the shelter director recounts how, after Gacha's fall, groups of people dug in the surrounding area in search of buried millions, but no one found anything. After Gacha's death, the main and in fact sole target of all special services became Escobar, and with his death in 1993, the Medellín Cartel vanished into thin air, leaving behind powerful drug distribution networks and a sea of blood, forever entering history as the founders of large-scale cocaine smuggling. It remains to tell what became of the Ochoa clan, who seemingly always remained in the shadows. I have already mentioned Fabio Ochoa Sr., the patriarch of the clan, at the beginning. Whether he was an unfortunate father or a shadowy ruler of the cartel, he lived a long and tranquil life, never brought to justice, and died in 2002 at the age of 88. In September 1990, Colombia's new president, Cesar Gaviria Trujillo, offered the cornered leaders of the narco cartels a chance to surrender to local police, promising not to extradite them to the United States. In 1991, all three Ochoa brothers surrendered, and after serving relatively short sentences, were released. Juan David and Jorge Luis settled in Medellín and were never again involved, becoming respectable businessmen, like their father. Juan David died in 2013 from a sudden heart attack. Jorge Luis, on the other hand, as of 2024, is still alive, despite a slow ongoing trial based on the testimonies of cartel militant Papai, given while he was already in prison. But the youngest brother, Fabio, after being released from prison, did not abandon hope of becoming a narco-baron and began collaborating with El Chapo and the Sinaloa cartel as a consultant. In the valley, he shared routes and working methods, actively participating in the Mexicans' lives. However, as already occurred in the situation with the Cuban Alberto Falcon, described in the video about the Guadalajara cartel, the Mexicans always dump non-Mexicans, no matter how famous a drug trafficker they might be. In 2001, during Operation Millennium in Miami, Fabio was captured along with 41 Mexicans, each of whom testified against him to mitigate their own sentences. The young Ochoa received 30 years in prison, which he is still serving today. In prison, he discovered a myriad of talents. For instance, he is involved in developing ocean wave energy, and he also wrote a 250-page popular science book, which, however, no one wants to publish yet. The approximate release date for Fabio Ochoa is September 14, 2024, should another parole request be approved this summer. After the destruction of the Medellín Cartel, its place in Colombia was taken by the Cali Cartel,